Amen. Okay, if nobody got one, there is a handout for this week's up there. That's the one. And then there's some from last week and a couple other weeks up there as well. Also, I will try to get us out early because I know with the speaker coming, our normal pews are far and few between. We all have to get to our normal spots or we might have a fit. Like this morning, I got to mine and somebody else was there. The nerve of those people. Just because I was learning about God a little bit too long, they thought they could sit in my spot. Also, we have the books out. I'm working on the last 2 DVDs. As you're aware, we had computer issues for the past 2 weeks. We solved that. We disconnected my keyboard completely. So, all the slides should go forward this week as a bonus. The books are over there as well. We are working on getting the entire set together, so there's a sign-up sheet over there. If you would like to buy the complete set of 12 when they're done, we're going to do $100, which means you're getting 2 for free. Normally they're 10 apiece. Payment is appreciated in advance just because it helps to offset the cost of all the materials. I don't make any profit in this pretty much. Just buying all the cases and CDs and the ink and the cartridge, et cetera, to make the copies of that. They will be ready to hand out on the 12th, which will be the week following our last class, and then I can deliver to you that morning, or we can meet up here early and I can give you the whole 12 like that. So that sheet is over there as well if you'd like to sign up for that. And I think that's the only announcement I have. Any other announcements you have? Questions, news articles, stories, something we've discussed? I haven't got any emails yet for the last class, so either it's going to be a real short class next week. Everybody said amen to that one.
At that museum, that mayor, or however you say his name, showed up. Did you get it?
I didn't see that one.
I'll email it to you.
Email it to me.
Showed up and to interrupt a meeting they were having and try to put down Christians.
I did not see that one. On the line of the museum there, just got notice from a charter member of the Creation Museum that's opening up in Kentucky, in Florence, Kentucky, which is just south of Cincinnati by about 6 miles. Answers in Genesis is opening it up. And originally it was going to be a $25 million project that they were asking for donations, debt-free, and it was going to be about 90,000 square feet. It is now, since all the publicity, and every day they have an interview from somewhere across the globe about this museum that's opening up in the small town of Florence. And so they've expanded the museum by about 90,000 square foot. So we're looking at about 140,000, 150,000 square foot museum devoted to the gospel and creation and how the evidence we see fits into the creation world, walks them through a presentation of the gospel, etc. Wonderful place. So that bumped the price tag up to $27,500, and I think they're right now about $300,000 away from opening debt-free in 2 weeks. So I think they're getting ready to do the grand opening finally on May 28th, so a little less than a month there. So be in prayer for that. So it is definitely something that needs to be in prayer. They are under attack. As a matter of fact, I was going to write that note today and I forgot, but talking about ambushing, is that what you're talking about, Bill Maher? That's the one she was talking about. I think it took a while for me to click in. Bill Maher, that has politically incorrect show, etc. on HBO. They had been requesting from Answers in Genesis an interview for forever, and Kent Ham, the president and founder of the company, had always turned him down politely, knowing that it would just be a moment to pick fun at him in Christianity, and he wouldn't listen to any real answers. So he said, no thank you, for years. And finally, they had got a request for a documentary to come through and explore their museum, and they followed all the correct channels, etc. So they said, sure, why not? Come through. They're very professional, signed in, did the visitor tags, did everything they're supposed to do to get to the museum while it's in construction. As they're doing this tour, Ken Ham's taking them on, and the staff's going on, he goes back to his office. Well, at about this break time, they have to bring some equipment into the back door. As they do that, they smuggle in Mr. Maher himself and put him into Ken Ham's office. And at this point, somebody says, there's a producer, somebody has some questions for you, and Ken Ham thought it was kind of ironic because his VP of Operations, Mark Lloyd, always let him know what was going on, who he was speaking with, and when. Thought, okay, well, whatever. Turns out his VP was under a distraction from one of the camera crew. So they didn't see this. He gets in there and he's ambushed by Bill Maher himself. So he goes, oh, great. So he started having a conversation, basically, and it's just what he had thought. It was a lambasting of Christianity and how it's wrong, and Ken Ham was giving answers as we're supposed to do, and he was defending it, and you could tell that Mr. Maher was not interested in the dialogue. It was mainly just to get on the show, and when he was confronted with the fact that this was an ambush, he goes, oh, there must have been some kind of mistake. Sorry, cross of paperwork, something of that nature. and then they hightailed it out of the museum. So they're looking for that to be shown sometime on his program on HBO, sometime here in the near future. But on that same note, they're also getting Anderson Cooper from 360 Degrees on CNN. Went and did a very worthwhile documentary on the museum. So for CNN to do a piece on a creation Christian museum and actually give it a fair shake is worthy to note as well. I think that played on March 1st or something. I think it's backlogged on Anderson Cooper Live. If you click on the link on CNN, you can probably pull most of that up. That's good to know. Anything else? As I catch my breath. That's a lot to cover. No? Whew, good. Okay, remember, think of questions. Email them to me. My email is right here, creation@evolutionontrial.com. Email me any question that we haven't covered, something you see that you think we should cover next week, and that's what the last class is going to be. Your questions, and I will provide reasonable, scientific, solid, biblical answers to it that you can take to somebody. Maybe it's a friend at the office that you said you've been going to this creation class, and they said, well, that's a bunch of hogwash, and they give you an excuse, and you just don't know how to overcome it. Bring it to me. If somebody, we're talking about last week, scientist that is Christian but has a lot of old earth stuff and is having a hard time with it, if there's a specific argument that that person is using, let me know. And if I don't have the answer, I will research it beforehand, and give you a solid answer to it. We all have people like that. Gentleman at my office or at my school, been a member of his church, been working there for 26 years, he's Methodist, but he does not believe that we live to 900 years old. Says believes the Word of God, believes the Bible, believes everything else, but he is old earth, and he doesn't believe that we live for 900 years old, or 600, or 700, or any of the ages given in the Bible. Okay? So those are some of the questions you may want to bring up. How can we talk about that? So bring those to us. And with that, we will get into what we call facing the giant, defeating the heroes of evolution. And what we're talking about here are those heroes or those icons that evolution are teaching the young kids, those that are teaching them in the biology book, which is where Evolution Exposed comes into play, because that's what this book is doing. It's taking those icons of evolution that are in all the 3 major biology books in the United States and tearing them apart with solid scientific answers. Because as I was getting ready for this class, I came across a quote from a chemist, Linnaeus Pauling, was winner of 2 Nobel Prizes. He says, "Science is the search for truth." Bruce Alberts, current president of the U.S. National Academy of Science, agrees. Science and lies cannot coexist. Said this in May of 2000, quoting Israel's statement, Simon Peretz, that you don't have a scientific lie, you cannot lie scientifically. Science is basically the search of truth. So, if science is the search for truth, why are we having this debate? Because we're all looking at the same evidence. As a creationist and as an evolutionist, I looked at the same piece of evidence. I didn't discover something new all of a sudden. I just put on my biblical glasses finally. I finally got to see it through the Bible, how Christ was talking about it. And then I started uncovering facts that were not presented to me in school. And it's a quote that I always end up saying is, if you're not taught both sides of the coin, that's indoctrination. It's not teaching. Teaching is saying, here's 2 sides, you decide. Okay, we're not talking about grammar rules here. We're talking about science. There's no right or wrong here. It's pretty much left to interpretation most of the time. And, if I turn this on, it would work a lot better. Darwin's Tree of Life is by first the biggest used icon of evolution out there. The reason is because it's talking about a descent from a common ancestor. Darwin's tree starts down here at a single point. And he wants you to believe that as a tree grows from its roots up and branches out to all its little tree buds and flowers and leaves, and it spreads out, that's exactly what we have done over the eons of time. It was a neo-Darwinist, Ernest Mayr, boldly proclaimed in 1991 that there is probably no biologist left today who would question that all organisms now found on the earth have descended from a single origin of life. Saying every biologist agrees with this assumption, that we've come from a single origin point into what we see today. That means the birds, the bumblebees, people, that we're all interrelated because we all started down here at some point in time. It says Darwin knew, though, and scientists have recently confirmed, that the early fossil record records the evolutionary tree of life upside down. The fossil record doesn't show this. And this is in every major biology book today. What the fossil record shows is it comes down like this. That we start getting rid of some of these species through extinction, through interbreeding. And we're going to look more into that in a minute. Because it says that if all living things are descended from a common ancestor, we have to ask ourselves the question, why are they so different? Do I look like a fruit fly? Okay, I know I am fruity. But that's beside the point. It says Darwin felt that if a natural population were exposed to one set of conditions and other parts were exposed to other conditions, natural selection could modify the various populations in different ways. And that given enough time, a whole different group of animals could arrive. Because I was getting ready for this class, so I thumbed back through my physical anthropology book from college. And while I was studying it, I didn't realize how anti-Christian this book was. Going back now, I go, But I found one piece of wording interesting. That Darwin did not set out to disprove creation. There was a different idea of animals back then. They thought from creation that everything that was in the earth currently was exactly the way God had created it, and that it could not change. They thought that there would be, God had created a zebra, and God had created a horse, and those two animals could not change. And that when they do change, they figured there's got to be something wrong. So when Darwin went out to his voyage on the MS Beagle to the Galapagos Islands and started studying these finches and these turtles, and he saw differences. He looked at the Alps on his way back through South America, and he said, there's different animals on this side than on this side. That's not what creation says. That's not what the Bible says. And that was the view back then. Was that because these animals were different, that had to mean there was change. And that's where Darwin started from. And so I looked at that and I went, that's interesting. What started Darwin's evolutionary idea is the very thought that starts creation now. We talked about that we all agree that we change slowly, don't we? Dogs have changed, people have changed, skin color has changed, eyes color. It doesn't change who we are, does it? It's minor changes through a population. We agree with that. Genetics agree with that. That's the foundation of creation science. And Darwin was using that very idea to spout evolution, or to start his theory on evolution. A gentleman by the name of Linnaeus, about 100 years before Darwin, came up with this classification system, and this is what Darwin was using to come up with this tree of life. And a quick, short biology lesson starts here. Species. We'll use human as a subset. We all know that we're called Homo sapiens. Sapiens is our species. It's the lowest one. Next is our genus. It goes into Homo. Then we go to the family. We're all part of hominids. Family also includes other apes. That's what I was looking for. Humans and apes are included in the hominids. Hominids and monkeys are included in primates. So it gets higher and higher. Then anything that gives live birth, produces milk for the young, fur, included in mammals. We're getting higher and higher. The phylum is next, basically anything with a vertebrae. We're looking strictly at humans. And then our kingdom are animals. That's the highest one. And there's a whole bunch of different phylum within the animal kingdom. For example, we look at my favorite fruit fly. Without going through all of this, we look at the phylum. It basically means that word that they have exoskeletons, bendable. They don't have vertebrae per se, but they are part of the insect class. But what do you notice? What are they still part of? Animals. So according to Darwin, guess what? You and I, we're related to fruit flies. That's what Darwin's saying. Darwin's saying because we're under that classification, we're all related. Looking at that tree of life. Because what the tree of life, according to Darwin, actually states is this. If we were to take it and start down here, and start at that lowest level of species, guess what happens? This tree of life, it branches up, and we'll say it turns into, not genus, but we'll say family, order. So all of these are families and orders of something. And then we flip that upside down. Families and orders can turn into classes, phylums, over eons of time, because Darwin states that natural selection acts by accumulating slight, successive, favorable variations. It can produce no great or sudden modifications. It can act only by short, slow steps. Meaning that it took eons of time for it to go from that genus of sapiens all the way up to the phylum. A long time. We would expect to see what? Thousands of fossils leading up to this point. But guess what? That's not what the fossil record shows. The fossil record shows a sudden explosion of phylum. Right there. Things with vertebrates. Things that have those exoskeletons. Things that don't, with shelled bodies. Fungi, plants. That phylum couldn't have started by itself. Darwin says it couldn't start with this great thing. It had to lead up to it by thousands and thousands of skeletons. And so what we get, instead of this curve showing how we're getting to this increasing number of phylum that we have today, that complicated name, here's what we see. All of a sudden there's nothing. And then explosion. They're all there at one time. We talked about that, the Cambrian explosion is what we called it. All of a sudden we see all of the known existing phylum at one time, and we see a deterioration of them due to extinction. And what could that extinction have been part of? The flood. We have a biblical answer to the science that we are currently seeing. You've seen this slide before in another presentation. Darwin says that this single organism leads up to these known phylum. The humans that we see, the vertebrae, the cows, the wolves, the insects, the lobsters, the shellfish, the mussels, the troglodyte, everything has led up to this point. So we should see fossils all down here. But we don't. All we see is a sudden explosion of life, of every known complex form of life. And guess what? By the fossil record, they haven't changed one bit since they first appeared on the earth. And that's exactly what God says. They were created after their own kind. Which leads us into Darwin's other mispopulation, is his finches. We talked about that a little bit last week. These are the heroes of evolution, the icons that are put into the biology books. Because they're always going to include Darwin's finches, because what do you notice? If you take a gander around the wheel, what do you notice about some of those beaks? They look the same.
Different sizes.
They look different. Different sizes. All different sizes. You have the small ground finch here. Woodpecker finch over here. Large tree finch here. And guess what the biology books teach us? That this is why Darwin started his theory. Then I found out those biology books were wrong. I even had thought that for a long time. This is how Darwin started his theory. Turns out that he had collected a bunch of these birds, about 13 of them, named some after himself, pretty egotistical of himself. Got back to England, started talking to an ornithologist, a bird studier, and realized he didn't know anything about these birds. He didn't record any of the information where they were from, what they were eating, any of the information he needed to make a classification. Darwin didn't have any of it. And so it actually finds out that he never looked at it. There's a historian of science named Frank Sulloway and states that Darwin possessed only a limited and largely erroneous conception of both the feeding habits and the geographical distribution of these birds. Bless you. It wasn't until the rise of neo-Darwinism in the 1930s that the Galapagos finches were elevated to their current prominence. Although Sulloway exploded the legend almost 20 years ago, many modern biology textbooks still claim the Galapagos finches inspired Darwin with the idea of evolution. So the biology books are saying, this is why he started it. Do you know why Darwin started it? When he got back to England, his friend, the ornithologist, started looking at these birds. Years later, he started thinking about it. Remember, the theory of evolution had been around a long time before Darwin. Lots of people from the Greco-Roman times had talked about it. And we talked about in the very first class how when Paul went to Mars Hill, they had an evolutionary culture then. Darwin wasn't the first one. He was the first one to write a book on it and to give it a title. Then he started thinking about these birds and how they might be kind of different. It wasn't until the 1930s that they said that Darwin used the finches. Here we have a textbook from Golden Key, Biological Science in 1996. It tells students that the finches played a major role in leading Darwin to formulate his theory of evolution by natural selection. Raven Johnson's Biology, 1999, says the correspondence between the beaks of the 13 finch species and their food source immediately suggested to Darwin that evolution had shaped him. These had nothing to do with how Darwin came up with his theory, but we like to give him credit, don't we? George Johnson's Biology, Visualizing Life in 1998, states that Darwin attributed the difference in bill size and feeding habits among the finches to evolution that occurred after their ancestor migrated to the Galapagos Islands. Goes on, tells students to imagine themselves in Darwin's place, meaning, what would you think if you saw it? Then it even goes on and says, write a journal pages that Darwin could have written. Now, coming as a 4th grade English language arts teacher, who we have the writing tax, sounds like a good practice. On the flip side of it, though, you're setting them up for failure. Right from the get-go. 1, Darwin never used it. 2, write a page as if Darwin himself could have written it. Automatically, you're putting the students, now obviously this is 9th grade biology class, setting them up to have an evolutionary thought. Well, due to the size of the food sources, the beaks had to evolve in order to eat their food, and they were better suited for their environment, and they must have come that way from something else. So if you start the students that way, though, is there any reason for them to start questioning it later? No. Any question?
I guess I would wonder if the beak was not already the size it needed for the food source, wouldn't that mean that the species would die out before the beak could evolve?
Glad you brought that up. We look at the biology book in Prentice Hall, which is one that we use around here. And here, if you notice, really, really light, so it didn't come out very good. My apologies. Put the light off here in a minute. You have it in your slides as well. It talks about how the beak variation goes up and down. Dry year to wet year. Dry year to wet year. What happens is, on those very wet years, the birds with the larger beaks tend to flourish. The beak we've actually seen, there was a gentleman by the name of Gates that actually lived on the island for 15 years and studied the birds. And the same birds, their beaks tended to swell or shrink depending on the wet or dry season because that produced the different types of seeds. What does that tell you? That their DNA code that God had created them with, it gave them the ability to adjust to the food source based on where they were living so that they, what? Wouldn't die out. Just like a polar bear is acclimated to swim in the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean, but you would never catch a grizzly doing it. He's perfectly suited, webbed feet and all, to live in that land. Is he any different than a grizzly bear, though? Same bear kind, aren't they? We know this because we just caught, or the poacher just shot one, that was a grizzly polar bear hybrid. Wasn't supposed to happen. This happened in the wild, by the way. Hybrid had the grizzly bear mask to it. They could tell, they tested the DNA to it, so they know for certain that it had both species to it. It was a hybrid of a polar bear and a grizzly bear. Showing that they're same kind as God had created, but they're suited to their environment, much like the people we talked about. Neanderthals were suited to live near the ice sheets after the flood. Homo erectus was suited to live where? Down lower Africa as it got hotter. Harsher environments to live on. So what Darwin's theory says is that over time, we should be seeing a what? A change in the finches. A complete change, not just in beaks, but everything about them should be changing. What does the evidence show, though? Evidence shows that the beaks have stayed the same the whole time. This is a study from 1977 to 1984. The beaks stayed the same the entire period of stretch of the imagination. So, we're not seeing what Darwin predicted at all in the finches. So we jump ahead to the peppered moths. Icon of evolution, or the hero of evolution, number 3. This is one that I loved in college. And it is still in my textbook. Matter of fact, these pictures were scanned in from this textbook. The peppered moths came from England. You had 2 variations of them. You had a light moth, which is over here. Can't really see him, can you? His body is right about here. And you had this dark moth. They both lived in different kind of areas. Which one do you think is less likely to be eaten by the birds that eat moths? The light. Okay? Which means the black ones tend to die off. So those that were light in color tended to flourish. This is the story they tell us in our books, by the way. Then, with the Industrial Revolution, England's burning lots and lots of coal. Lots of black soot coming out of the chimneys and the factories, and it is blackening the trees. And along with that blackening of the trees, we now see which one is more favored for its environment. The black or the white one? The black one. So now we're saying it's better suited for its environment. Evolutionists, including anthropologists, are saying this is evolution in action. We are seeing natural selection play out. This one is now naturally suited for its environment. It's not going to get eaten as readily as this one. We changed the environment, it adapted. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of it, ask you this question because it never even dawned on me. Because this is what the students are the same thing. It says it in the books, therefore, that's good. Never even dawned on me until I started researching creation science, evolution, etc. Are these still moths? Did that dawn on anybody yet? Evolution says they're supposed to change. This is an example of evolution in the works. Have they changed from moths? No. They're still moths. So that doesn't prove evolution. That change shows that we have that micro concept, small changes within a population. The bad part of this is these photos have been staged. Doesn't tell us that in the books. And I promise you it's in the biology books in high school as well. Sir?
If the light-colored moths are getting eaten more in the dark environment, they're eaten. How do they evolve? They're eaten.
Well, they're not all eaten at one time. It's just meaning their population's getting thinned out. That you're going to have an increase of these and a decrease in this population. Make sense? They're not going to be wiped out or eradicated. They could be. But then what the evolutionists would say is that they would be better suited in those areas that were not affected by the soot. That's where they're going. What I mean by stage, though, these were killed and pinned to the trees for the photographs. Guess what? Come to find out, moths like this, they don't rest on the tree trunks at all. The photo was staged to make a point. Huh. Interesting. Brian, could you get that hair down a little bit for me, please? Oh, he's already on top of it. Thank you. Which leads into this next slide. We talked about how evolution has to be the gaining of information. It cannot mean the deletion of information. And that's what we see here. As we go from a wolf to a coyote, if you push it down and hit the button that says set, it'll set it. To a dingo, to a collie, to a chihuahua. During that whole process, we're losing information. Every time. Because guess what? This chihuahua can never become a wolf again. It's lost all this genetic information. It can't go backwards. Just like we talked about the poodle. The reason the poodle has that type of hair, it's lost the genetic code for the hair to break off at a certain length. It's been bred that way. It can never gain that information back to all of a sudden get a regular dog's hair. It's going to always look like a freak. Who has a poodle in here? Nobody? Wow, that's the first time ever. Usually people start throwing stuff at me by that time. So we never see the gaining of information. So we talked about the fruit flies. Icon of evolution number 4, beyond the pepper moth. Last week we talked about how they were irradiated or shoved with radiation, irradiated with it, to try to make them mutate. We know that flies populate rather quickly. We also know that they don't have a long life cycle, 24, 48 hours. So we can go through a whole generation, make a 15 million year leap in a matter of months, if we keep them contained. And so what they did was they kept pouring radiation on them, trying to get them to change. And what they got, as I stated last week, is we got different wing types called the wild type, kind called bar eyes, meaning they got a different pair of eyes. Wings turned into a cut style. Wings that were small, unable to fly. One that had a rotated abdomen. It was completely backwards. Come down here. And this one is actually the wings shriveled up and came down here. We got curly, crippled wings. We got a biothorax, meaning that it changed its shape. And then wing type change. Here we saw 4 wing types: blue wings, purple wings, red wings, yellow wings, green. All the colors imaginable in the wings. We saw some that had 4 eyes, no eye, blind eye, 1 eye. Everything imaginable. Some had real long hair, some had no hair, some had short hair. Every time, though, for the equivalent of about 15 million years, guess what? It never changed from a fruit fly. That's not told in the biology books. It's shown that fruit fly experimentation, they use it, shows genetic drift.
How many million years did you say?
Roughly 15 million. That's what they put it through. And they just kept eradicating it. And guess what? Over time, guess what happened?
It went back.
It went back. Those that they left alone started going back to what their original form was. Just like dogs end up going back. They can't ever go all the way back, but they started, the DNA started replicating itself, correcting itself, just like God had designed it to do. This one is still in the biology books. Haeckel's embryos. What Ernest Haeckel did, about 90 years ago, push it down to like 66. You're on film doing it too, so don't worry. It's all you. There you go. I love editing these later on. It's really fun. He stated that we all look the same at the very beginning. There it comes. This is a salamander. Goes into a turtle, chicken, pig. Finally, we have a human down here. And what his drawing was attempting to show is that we all came from what? A common ancestor. Remember Darwin's tree we talked about at the very beginning? Common ancestor led to everything, so we should have some kind of similarity. So he drew these pictures. About 5 years after he did it, someone found them out. That Ernest Haeckel had made it up. He didn't look at any of the embryos. He drew it by freehand, fudged some here and there, duplicated some others, he said, and for about 20 years it was thrown out. Never to be seen from again. 25, 30 years later, someone rediscovered his drawings and went, whoa, that really proves evolution. Guess what they did with that drawing? They stuck it back in our biology books with the saying of Haeckel's embryos. 15 years later or so, they discovered again that it was a fake, left the picture in, took out the paragraphs about it. They may not even give it a blurb underneath the caption anymore. What they will do, though, is leave it there. Titled Haeckel's Embryos, 1940, 1950, whatever. And let the student decide. What have they just done? They've tainted the pool, haven't they? Because if they see this in their book, wow, all look pretty similar to a certain point. Here we start changing. That must mean I'm related to the salamander, which means we really did crawl out of the water. If we look at the actual evidence, though, this is the true development stage. Here's what Haeckel said. Here's the actual appearance of those same at that same stage. Do they look anything alike? And you see it down here. Fish, frog, turtle, chicken, and a human. Do the original stages even resemble what Ernest Haeckel drew? The original drawings, the original set, is not in a biology book. This is not in a book. Only this one. What does that tell us? Yes, sir?
My son and I got on this conversation the other day. He's a junior down the street here at Wanchie. And in class, right off the bat, they presented it. Said, well, we're not going to, this is the theory of evolution. You don't have to believe it, but we're just going to present the facts. And so something like that comes across as the facts. And so he was like, well, it's not that big a deal. I said, it is a big deal. I said, because those facts from their perspective and the facts from the creation perspective are totally different.
Absolutely. And that's what they're counting on. They're counting on their ability to not have to present the information, but that if they leave it there, somebody will read it or look at the pictures, and that's all they have to do. We've seen this picture before in class. Dino bird, Archaeopteryx. This is another one used readily in 9th grade biology books. Archaeopteryx turning from a dinosaur into a bird. Okay? And we see all these nice feather impressions around the edges. It's the only one that has had feather impressions. Guess what we have proven over time, without going to the nitty-gritty of it? We have proven that it is nothing more than a bird. The reason they said it was a dinosaur is they said it had teeth in its beak. Birds aren't supposed to have teeth. And it had claws on its wings. Well, we do have some birds like that. Bats are like that. They have claws on the tips of their wings. Doesn't mean they're a dinosaur. And the teeth. An article came out a few years back. They had some mutated chicken eggs. And guess what the chickens hatched out with? Teeth. They killed them right away. But it just shows that if it's a mutation, it's the only one we found, so is it possible that this was a mutation? Absolutely. Does it mean that it could have been a bird that had teeth? Yes. We don't know all of God's created kind. We don't know what kind of gene pool there was prior to the flood. So maybe this is the way they were originally created. We don't know. What we do know is that it's not a dinosaur, it is a bird. And what they did to populate this theory is they came up with one back in the early 1900s called Archaeoraptor. An Archaeoraptor was discovered, and they discovered that it had two pieces put together. It was a forgery. That had the tail of a dinosaur put onto a primitive bird. They discovered this after National Geographic had run an article. What the article said was, feathers for a T-Rex. And they ran a picture explaining that its combination of advanced and primitive features is exactly what scientists would expect to find in dinosaurs experimenting with life. They ran this in 1999, so it's not that long ago. Once they found out there was a forgery, everybody was up in arms at how National Geographic had jumped the gun. But honestly, tell me that any other magazine wouldn't have done the same thing. They just were glad it wasn't them, and they got a chance to ruin National Geographic's reputation for a little bit. So I love this cartoon. It's called A Party of Paleontologists, paleontologists. Pin the tail on the Archaeoraptor. Because then, what happened is, they had a new one that came up. This one was about the size of a chicken. About 3 feet, a little bit longer than 3 feet at the tail. And what they said was this was the most bird-like dinosaur they'd ever seen from the skeleton. Said, in fact, paleontologists who examined it proclaimed it to be the most bird-like dinosaur yet discovered. Remarkable missing link between birds and dinosaurs. This is supposed to exist 75 million years before that Archaeopteryx one. Before the bird dinosaur. Then the gentleman who's in charge of putting them together, Brian Cooley, specialized in it, explained to all the participants at this museum that he was going to set out to make Bombearaptor, which is what it's referred to, as bird-like as possible. He reconstructed the muscles using bird anatomy as his guides, and he placed the eyes in a bird-like orientation using the same artificial eyes taxidermists used to put in stuffed eagles. Guessing that it must have been covered with scruffy feathers, he went on and added those to his reconstruction as well. This is a drawing of the one he had displayed behind a plexiglass window. And we need to think about it, because scientifically speaking, as an archaeologist, as one that would newly define discoveries, we need to remember that you always want to put forth the utmost care in your first draft. Because guess what? That first report you publish is what they look at for everything. And in this one, let me read to you what they wrote. The official description of this animal contains several drawings of the reconstructed animal, 2 of which show hair-like projections on the body and feathers on the forelimbs. But nothing remotely resembling hairs or feathers were ever discovered with this skeleton. The idea is the theory says that they must be there, therefore we're going to put them on the model. But no, let me repeat, no hairs, no feathers were found with this skeleton. That's what was found. They reconstructed it. And then because he wanted it, he says, to look like a bird, he put it together like that. Remember how I showed you the picture of the museum during the dinosaur lecture of Archaeopteryx, and you had the dinosaur and the Archaeopteryx down here, and you had the other 2 bird-like dinosaurs in the middle? That was one of them. He doesn't exist. It's fabrication, complete science fiction. They don't tell you that in your biology books. They don't tell you that at the museums. Then we have the ultimate lie. How many is familiar with seeing an icon of evolution like this? Going up from the monkey into man. Because despite the lack of evidence of Darwinian human origins, this was soon and has soon, and that's way off the map, isn't it? Has it been like that all the time?
No,
It's been evolving. In reverse.
There. You have the pictures. I don't know why. That's interesting.
Maybe so you're turning a little ball.
No, I don't have my mouse activated. Oh well. It says, soon we started showing a knuckle-walking ape evolving through a series of intermediate forms into an upright human being. These drawings have been seen in what? Textbooks, cartoons, editorials, Newsweek, Timeline. Any book imaginable has shown this. And there's a whole different series of them. Now you see them going from ape-like up to man into the computer sitting. So it's going from hunchback to hunchback still. They constitute the ultimate icon because they symbolize the implication of Darwin's theory by the ultimate meaning of human existence. Because ultimately, Darwin started with his finches, but what did it turn into? It turned into the fact that we came from apes. That's why as I looked at the classification system that Linnaeus did, it puts us with the apes. We're primates. Why? Because we have 5 fingers, like primates do. We share characteristics with them. And so as other people say, how can you have those characteristics and not be related to them? The best answer you can give somebody is we have a common designer. Look how a Corvette has changed. Would anybody say that a Corvette evolved from the way it was in 1954 to where it is today? Still a Corvette. It has not changed. It's had slight modifications to it by who? Its designer. The designer is always implicated for it. I don't leave a car out here and it changes. What happens is that second law of thermodynamics. It breaks down. Rust forms onto it. The paint starts chipping off. Vandals break into it. Steal the hubcaps, the rims, and next thing I know, it's just a pile of rust and dust. Sir?
I've been away from school science long enough to get my entropy and entropy confused. Is it entropy where things break down?
Yes, entropy.
Okay, now, earlier you said that he had it starting out from one source and branching out and everything. Isn't that in direct conflict with entropy?
Yes, it is.
And so they don't try to justify that?
No. They try to say that the second law of thermodynamics, we covered it briefly once, is that it only works on an isolated system or a closed system. And the planet is really an open system. So that's the way the evolutionists get around it. And it's truly not, because the universe itself is a closed system. It is not limitless. It has a boundary. It stops. It is closed off. And so their reasoning is that circular reasoning they try to use for the second law of thermodynamics. Sir?
Something I've never understood is, okay, evolution, the whole thought is improving on itself.
Yes.
And if we evolved from apes, why do we still have apes?
Give that question. It's always a hard one to answer. Thanks. Way to go. Sure, you couldn't use that one for next week, could you? No! Ask for questions for the Q&A, and he brings it to me now. You might have to wait till next week. You might have to wait for that one next week. The short answer is, why is it that kids still have grandparents? We came, grandparents gave their parents, and we came from there. So why do we still have grandparents if we exist? That's the answer that evolutionists will use. That make sense? No. Okay, I'll give you a better answer next week. How about that one? It's a long, drawn-out, complicated answer. Darwin said that you start here and things branch out. We are related to fruit flies, according to Darwin. Okay? We branch out. Essentially, they don't look that different from each other. Slight modifications. Maybe whatever this organism was had one wing. So now this one has 2 and this one has no wings. Okay? With me? Slight modifications over a long period of time. Eventually, this one is suited for its environment and this one is suited for where it lives. Okay? So now, that population is going to keep going. Guess what? We still have these fruit flies with 2 wings, and we still have these fruit flies with no wings. Yes? You with me? You lose it. I'm losing, right? Got me? Why are they still existing at the same time if they're evolving from each other?
Not selected out.
Not selected out. They're going by their own environment. Chimps, if we were down here, we'll break down to chimps and humans. Okay? Chimps break off. We start walking upright, but we still look like a monkey. They're still on all fours. How the evolutionists would argue it. We still have a common ancestor down here, yes? He's still alive. Now we have knuckle-dragging apes. Now we're walking on two legs. We start branching off, yes? Into different directions. We come up to where we are today because we're suited for our environment. Natural selection has made us where we are today. Yet in the African savanna or the plains, they're still walking on all fours because they're suited for that environment. So why do we still have these two coexisting when we came from each other? Does that make better sense?
And all the steps in between weren't needed.
And all the steps they were just slow, but there's no record of it. That's the whole point. There's no record showing those changes as we branch out, according to Darwin. That make a little bit more sense? I could draw it out by hand better for you. Sir?
And again, if you start branching off, you've got the humans or whatever, it's branching off towards humans, and then you've got your monkeys. Wouldn't you keep having multiple branches?
Branches that some would die out, some would be dead ends, some would, like the tree of life, I'll pull it there again in a minute, would show, you have these clusters. Some would die out, some would continue to grow. That's why they say with human evolution, creatures like Homo habilis, or Homo erectus, Neanderthal, Australopithecus afarensis, Ramidus, so forth, these were dead ends. They started branching off the tree line, leading into humans, but they died out. They weren't successful. Okay? What we came from, they say that Neanderthal was a dead branch, that we aren't related to Neanderthal, that we're related to Homo erectus. They were successful to come to us, but Neanderthals died out. That's what evolution states. That you have these dead branches, but they can coexist because they all came from that single spot. And as they diverge, they're going to coexist.
Okay, were there ape man number 3 there in the middle?
Yes.
Part ape, part man. Were there ever any fossils, any skeletons, anything found that document that facial design or anything?
The facial design itself is where you're looking at more like Neanderthal, with that heavier jaw set, sharper brow ridge coming out, longer back here, that we know is due to biomechanical stress from the jaw chewing, from leather, maybe what they're eating. The cold climate, we know, can shape that face, maybe not be that pronounced. This is right here is what they would call Cro-Magnon man, same as modern Homo sapien. They call it. So this one and the last ones you can't see are really the same. This is what they would classify as Lucy, the second one. Starting to walk upright, bent knee. That's how they get around. That's what they're classifying it as. Sir?
The second one kind of looks like an orangutan.
It does look like an orangutan. Okay, and as we close up, I'll give you one last quote. Then I'll take any questions you have. Most of this started, as we've said before, in the Scopes trial. Scopes trial back in Tennessee, that they said they had a law on the book. It's called the Butler Law, and it said that it shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, or any public schools of the state to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Put it on the books. Can't teach evolution. They're sitting around a coffee shop, biology teacher comes in playing tennis, and they ask him to do it. They're baiting it. Lawsuit ensues when he starts teaching evolution and biology. Lawsuit comes up, and they let it get it out. Mr. Bryan, over here, who was the ardent opponent for creationism, he was the attorney, he was an older gentleman, good in his day, stepped up and made a horrible argument, opening case. Didn't start on the right foot. The ones trying to prove evolution start off with this argument. They said, after a while, Your Honor, it is the setting of man against man and creed against creed until with flying banners and beating drums, we are marching backward to the glorious age of the 16th century, where bigots lighted faggots, meaning cigarettes, to burn the men who dared to bring any intelligence and enlightenment and culture to the human mind. Because according to science, we didn't hit the age of enlightenment until the 17th century when we started teaching evolution. And at this point, they put Mr. Bryan, the attorney, on the stand as a biblical expert. one of the questions they asked him was, do you believe the Bible? True, literal. He said, absolutely. Took the stand, he was confident. Now, first question they asked him, do you think the earth was made in 6 days? He said, not in 6 days of 24 hours. The crowd gasped. That was heresy. Everybody knows that 6 days was 24 hours. A day is 24 hours. Automatically, this biblical expert had put his foot in his mouth. And it goes on, it says, the crowd gasped. The Bible read 6 days. What was Brian thinking of? Toward the end of the afternoon, he brought the biblical story of Adam and Eve and the serpent. Had God punished the serpent by making him crawl on his belly? Brian said he believed that. And then Darrell, the attorney, asked, have you any idea how the snake went before that time? No, sir. Do you know whether he walked on his tail or not? No, sir, I have no way to know. The crowd laughed. Brian's hands nervously trembled and his lips quivered. Come to find out he was in diabetic shock and he died 5 days later. But he didn't have the answers. The final question they asked him, which is not in my book, is, where did Cain get his wife? He went, I don't know, the Bible doesn't tell me that. And he was making an argument, but the evolution is saying he had to have married someone. If Adam and Eve were the only ones there would be nobody else for him to marry. The answer is simple, though. The Bible says he had many sons and daughters. It doesn't tell us when Cain married, or how old Cain was when he married, or how old his wife was when they got married. The simple fact of the matter was he married his sister, or cousin. We don't know, but he was a relation. It was not illegal until the time of Moses to do that, to marry one's first cousin or sister. And because of that answer, evolution was allowed to be brought into schools. That one answer. Because a biblical expert couldn't answer the very simplest questions about his faith, involving evolution and involving just basic biblical history. That is why we are here. To answer and to give an answer to all those who ask. But we are to do it with meekness and gentleness as we do it. Sir?
I was just going to say that they would bring up the genetic pathos of intermarrying between relatives, but the pathogens were not really introduced into society until mankind became more corrupt.
Adam and Eve back then were perfect. They were created perfectly. Their children would still have been pretty much perfect. Sin had just started to creep into their lives. There would not have been a genetic problem of 4 legs and 2 arms, arm going out the head from marrying one sister. As we would say today, we make fun about, Arkansas and Tennessee and West Virginia. Every place else over there in the South. With that, remember, my email, if you don't have it, is creationevolutionontrial.com. Email me your questions this week so I can put together next week's PowerPoint. The sooner the better, otherwise I got to make stuff up, and that's just never pleasant for you guys. Fun for me. Again, make sure you sign in. This week's handout is over here. If you want to purchase a copy of the 12 DVDs when they're finished, sign up list is over there. As well, if you'd like to pay me, the books are there. The first 9 CDs are over here as well. Thank you. If you have any questions, I will be here. Have a great evening.